He is not here. He is risen were words and a reality that forever changed the world. They changed it. God himself came in the flesh and he walked in the earth, and people said, man, this guy teaches differently. This guy ministers differently. This guy is ushering and living out a way that is completely different. But then all of a sudden he died on a cross. And it's like, oh yeah, he's just a good dude who died. Like a lot of people die. Unfortunate. But when that tomb was empty and people saw that this God-man was in the flesh, and he was the Messiah who claimed to raise from the dead, and he had actually risen from the dead, it changed history. But it didn't just change history. It transformed people's lives. And the question is, as we've been celebrating Easter, the question is as we look at what Jesus has done, we know it changed history. The bigger question is it transforming our lives? The early disciples had to make those types of decisions. They walked with Jesus, they saw him resurrected in the flesh, and they decided, based on what they had come to experience in the person and the work of Jesus, this was going to and was transforming them because, well, of the resurrection power of Jesus. But I want you to know that those disciples, it wasn't like this instant, like, oh, this is easy for us. Do you know that the disciples, if you were to study and look at their lives and their world, that the religious opposition to them was really, really strong? They had to make a decision post-resurrection. Were they going to stick in the religious circles that they had, or were they going to obey the person of Jesus and walk in the ways that Jesus had taught them? Were they going to accept the Spirit that God had granted them to dwell in them? And were they going to listen to that Spirit and walk in its power? They had religious decisions to make that left them in opposition with many of the people that they loved and looked up to. It wasn't just religious power, though, that they were in opposition against. It was also social and political power. Do you know that the disciples, when they chose to follow and live out the resurrection power inside of their lives, it cost them financially and it cost their status. And they had to decide, were they going to allow that? Were they going to walk in that and trust Jesus? Do you know it also cost them personally? They had to decide in their own internal being, were they going to be people of faith? And when I say people of faith, I'm not talking about some blind, ambiguous faith that's out there. I'm talking about, were they going to be people that trusted the faithfulness of God, the promises that he declared, and the covenant that he established? Were they going to be people who would walk by that type of faith and oftentimes forego their human logic and certainly their human feelings? They felt that pressure. They had to make those types of decisions. But the disciples who would become the church, they found that the resurrection power was not only compelling them to do that, it was empowering them to do that. And it absolutely transformed their world and the world as we know it today. And I want to ask us, are we going to respond to the resurrection power of Jesus in our moment in history the way the followers of Jesus throughout history have done that? That's why we're starting this Church and Culture series. And over these next 5 weeks, we're going to look at 5 distinct relationships that the church has been set apart for amidst our culture to lead the way in. Let me phrase it this way. The church is responsible in these 5 areas to set the temperature like a thermostat. The church is the standard, and then we all grow and live into that, rather than the church just being a thermometer and taking the pulse of how we are or aren't doing and saying like, oh, we're doing better than them. No, the church is responsible in these 5 areas to set the temperature and say, this is who God is and this is how the people of God respond. And the first distinctive we're going to look at is the ministry of mercy and hospitality. And if you look at what Jesus teaches in mercy and hospitality and the way the church responds to it, you will see a transformational realm in their midst. Let me just start with this. Mercy, by simple definition, is this. It's unmerited favor. It's the fact that they didn't deserve it, and we still treat them favorably. Why do we do that? Because God does that for us, right? We don't deserve it as sinners who have offended God and done everything anti-him. We're alienated and enemies against him, and God chooses in his character and because of his love to grant us his favor, his blessing. But it's not just about mercy, it's also about hospitality. Hospitality is unmerited favor, but it's for the love of strangers. We need to unpack a few things before we get into this teaching so that we can apply it accurately. You need to understand that our version of the word hospitality is different than the biblical frame of hospitality. When we think of hospitality, we oftentimes think of entertainment, right? I'm going to invite a bunch of people over and I need to entertain them. I need to show off my best so that they feel and have a good experience. That's not biblical hospitality. Biblical hospitality is not about entertaining people. It's about engaging people for their benefit. And there's a big difference. I'll share it this way. We had no desire to spend church resources on putting a new website together to entertain a bunch of folks. You guys didn't need a better website from our church, right? But we did need to revamp our website so that it could engage people that were spiritually curious so that they could find the answers that they needed to move forward in their faith. And so we chose to be hospitable, to love strangers in that way. And you can go check out a new website that just launched yesterday. And hopefully as you share it with people in your world, it will help them take their spiritual next steps. There's things that we do as the church to make sure we set the standard in mercy and hospitality. As we do this, you need to know from a church and culture standpoint that mercy and hospitality will turn the heads of our world in two ways. They will either be curious, whoa, what are those people that are following Jesus and doing it? Like, what are they doing? And they'll have curiosity, but oftentimes, instead of curiosity, it will be criticism. They will critique when we set the standard in things because, well, we all have insecurities and insufficiencies, and it's easier to point the finger at like, well, they're just crazy, so that we don't have to deal with our own crazy. But this is what we need to know about mercy and hospitality. It turns the heads of the world, but when applied person to person, mercy and hospitality actually lifts the heads of people. Have you noticed that? When you grant somebody unmerited favor, something that they don't deserve, and when you love people, even though you don't know them, rather than their heads being down, their eyes come up. And they feel what God designed in them, worth and value and human connection. And the church is responsible for setting the standard in mercy and hospitality. And Jesus' teaching is going to lead us in that this morning. Luke chapter 14 is where we're headed. It's page 968 in the Bibles that are right there in front of you. Starting in verse 1 through 6, you'll see it. On one Sabbath, when he went out to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. Do you notice their heads turning? They were, whoa, this guy's different. They're watching him, and you notice in that watching him critically, or were they curious, or were they a little bit of both? And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy, and Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on the Sabbath, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Do you notice right here when Jesus starts this conversation as he's leading the disciples and those that are gathered in mercy and hospitality, he makes them consider the difference between their head and their heart and their actions. He makes them accountable to their motives. And did you notice when it's somebody that they didn't know personally, they were willing to withhold favor? But when Jesus brought it to be a name and a face that they knew, they couldn't respond because they knew they would always act favorably to somebody that meant something to them, that could benefit them. mercy and the difference between church and culture is this. Culture extends grace when we know people, when it's a benefit to them and to us, and we withhold truth because we don't want to be hard on people and we want to not upset or disrupt the peace. But if we don't know somebody, we go really heavy on the truth side so that we can prove a point, but very empty on the grace side to make them feel extra guilt and shame, and maybe then they'll wake up. That's what the culture does between the tensions of truth and grace and extending mercy, but that's not how the church sets the temperature. The church is responsible for setting the temperature in any and every situation to always lead with truth and always lead with grace. They're the same reality. You've got to push both at the same time, and we do so without favoritism. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. You're over here doing this for people you love, but you're not doing it for people you don't know. And Jesus says that's not the ministry of mercy and hospitality. He goes on in verses 7 through 11. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the place of honor, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with the shame to take the lower place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, you have to know there is a little bit of cultural differences between how we invite people, right? Oftentimes when we're throwing wedding feasts and banquets, like the list of people to invite is so large and you're trying to condense that down to as small as possible to fit in the venues and the budgets and all of that type of stuff. That's not the way they did feasts back then. This was a whole community thing, right? Everybody was invited to this thing. Think of it more as church rather than your wedding, right? Everybody's welcomed here. Now the question is when people gather at these things, where are they going to sit? How are they going to feel? Have you noticed in church world, the seats of honor are not the front seats. They're not the inside seats, right? We like the back rows and the outside seats. And we have to, as people developing the ministry of mercy and hospitality, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going to be the type of people that give up our seats, knowing that there are people that are walking into gatherings that don't know anybody? They're nervous because they're spiritually curious, but they're trying to figure out what this looks like for them. And are we going to be the type of people that sit in the humble seats rather than in the seats of our preferred preferences? And I'm making a joke about how we gather in here to try to help you see how you ought to gather in other environments. Do you recognize that everywhere you go as a Christian, you should be looking into that environment and saying, how do I take the humble seat in the room that serves the people of the room rather than positions myself to be known and to receive glory or networking? Have you noticed this about our culture? Our culture oftentimes positions us so that we can build our personal brand. And honestly, our companies train us to go into environments to build our corporate brand. And we have to be careful with that. We've got to be, honestly, as Christians, we have to say, yeah, I want to serve my company. Be loyal to them. They're paying you. You should serve them as you serve the Lord in worship. But you've got to be careful as a Christian not to always be walking into environments saying, how does this benefit me? Or how does this benefit my company? Christians take a different seat at the table because our motive is different. The muscle that moves mercy and hospitality is the muscle of humility. And Jesus says, notice, he has to humble those who exalt themselves, but those who humble themselves, they will have kingdom influence. He will build his kingdom around humility, exercise toward mercy and hospitality. The text goes on in verse 12 through 14. He said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. All right, now Jesus has helped them consider the difference between their head and their heart and their actions. And he has asked them to consider building this muscle of humility, and now he's going to challenge them with a few things, and he's challenging you and I with similar things. And so here's the challenge, number 1 of 3. It's a challenge to look at our lists. Think of your people list. Who runs in your circles? And when you think about your people list, does it reflect a list of mercy and hospitality? As he looks at his disciples in those teaching, he says, hey, have you noticed the people who run in your circles? They're not, well, they don't involve the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. The people who kind of run in your circles are the people who benefit you. Yeah, you serve them and you give to them and you help them, but you know deep down, if you had something wrong, like they could do the same for you. And he challenges them to say, like, hey, we've got to set the standard in unmerited favor. Is the church not responsible for loving on people who have no ability to love us back? Jesus says, that's what the Father did for you, and I've set the church apart to live out this level of mercy and hospitality. You and I need to be challenged to look at the lists of our life and ask ourselves, have we made room for the people that Jesus wants us to make room for? He goes on with a second challenge here in verses 15 through 20. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said, blessed is everyone who will eat the bread of the kingdom of God. But he said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field. I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Have you noticed when Jesus starts to teach about mercy and hospitality and how we have to set different standards in this, people start to make excuses. And the early disciples had to decide whether or not they were going to live by resurrection power or whether they were going to make excuses. And you and I too have to decide, is the empty tomb and Jesus being alive and him giving us access to resurrection power, is it going to keep us from making excuses? Let me say it this way. You can make progress or you can make excuses, but you can't make both. Let me say it this way to us as a church. We can make disciples and have kingdom influence, or we can make excuses, but we can't do both. We have to look at our lists, but we also have to examine our excuses. And excuses in our day and age are plentiful. And then there's this third challenge that Jesus offers the people in verses 21 through 24. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. And the servant said, Sir, what you have commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go out to the highway and the hedges and compel people to come in that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet. You and I have been challenged to look at our list, to examine our excuses, but we've also been challenged to update our urgency. Oftentimes when we think about who's around us that needs an invite into a relationship with Jesus, we're like, well, I don't think about them. And we come back to the Father because we care about the world around us. And we say like, well, I don't know who else to ask. And Jesus is saying, did you go to the highway and the hedges? Because there are people out there that are spiritually curious. Can I just tell you right now in this moment, we are living among one of the most spiritually curious generations that has ever walked the face of the earth. And people are hungry for a supernatural realm. They've seen the natural world and they go, it has its limitations. I want to know what's beyond this world. And they're spiritually curious. But do you know, even in a spiritually curious generation, that only 1 out of 3 people will respond to an invitation from you to explore what's beyond this natural world and in the supernatural world. Which means you and I have to build humble muscles that allow us to be rejected 2 out of 3 times and not lose a sense of urgencies in going to the highway and the hedges to make sure people get to experience the mercy, the unmerited favor of God, and the hospitality, the very love of God in their lives. Let me share something exciting for you. Do you know if you care about somebody and you invite them to join you in your spiritual journey, whether that's to read a Bible study with you, whether that's to go to a small group, a church event, come to church with you, like whatever that looks like for that, if you invite a person into that and you say to them, would you go grab coffee with me or breakfast with me before we go to that thing? Or you say, let's join at that thing and then we'll grab lunch after that. Do you know the chances of them saying yes to you go up by 70 to 80%? People are hungry for human connection. They're hungry to talk about things that matter. They're hungry to have a real conversation with a real person. And the biggest question is, are we just over here taking a thermometer pulse on our culture and saying like, yeah, it's a tough world to live in? Or are you and I setting the standard in what it looks like to make our lives available to extend mercy and hospitality to people that maybe aren't even on our list? Are we going to examine our excuses? And are we going to pray that the resurrection power of Jesus puts an urgency inside of our being that makes us see the world different? The disciples did that, and the church transformed the world. When people take resurrection power of Jesus seriously, it turns the heads of the world and it lifts the eyes of the people that get to experience it. And so as we look at this, I give you this thing. You'll see this image up here. This image is in our house. I took the picture off of the mantle that is hanging by the TV, and I'll read the quote if you can't read it in just a second, but I put it on the kitchen table at our house because I don't know if you guys are like Jenny and I, but the more demanding life gets and the schedules get busy and money's flying out all these different directions for kids and all these things that we care about, it's really easy to like just want our homes to become like a safe place. We might even call it comfortable. But the more comfortable our homes become, when we live in a season of that, have you noticed, like Jenny and I have noticed, that we can become critical of the outside world? The more we build comfort, the more critical we become. And we've noticed in our lives, the more critical we become of the outside world, the more calloused we become toward people. And the more calloused we become, when we look at our relationship with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we recognize the farther and farther away it gets from being the Christ-like people that Jesus has set his church apart to be. And so we have this thing that sits on our wall in our room to remind us that when we have more than we need to be a type of people that build longer tables rather than bigger fences. Because it's really, really easy to quit exercising the mercy of, or the muscle of humility that leads us to being people of mercy and hospitality. When you think about mercy and hospitality, it is the gospel that works, but it is mercy and hospitality that moves this from a message to an experience. If you want to see the gospel come alive in your life and in the lives of others, become a person of mercy and hospitality. When you think about mercy and hospitality in college terms, some of us, I know, we're thinking of people who are very merciful and hospitable, and we think to ourselves like, oh, they're gifted in that. And so when we think about that, like, oh, mercy and hospitality, those are the elective courses in college. If you want to dabble in that, you go take that course. And if you want to be good at that, you really go take those courses. Can I just tell you this? That according to Jesus and the ways of Jesus and the ways of his church led by the Holy Spirit, mercy and hospitality are not elective courses. They are gen eds. They're mandatory. It's just who we are because who God has been to us. And if we can't learn as the people of God, the church that has been set apart by God, to be people of mercy and hospitality, it will be really hard for us to see God move in our time or through our lives. Can I just tell you that mercy and hospitality have absolutely changed the world? Do you know that the church hasn't just helped people, but it has transformed the world as we know it today? Let me just tell you that in the first century, it was one of the most persecuted times in human history. And as people were being persecuted because they were responding to the resurrection of Jesus differently than other religions, they went to great spaces of torturing them, and these people still chose mercy toward those who were persecuting and martyring them. They chose to love strangers that they didn't even know, even though it was going to cost them their life, very likely. Most all of the disciples died being persecuted and martyred because they believed in the resurrection power of Jesus and they practiced mercy and hospitality. Do you know that in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, it was the Christians who became known for caring for people as people were mass exiting cities and towns because of plagues? It was Christians that stayed back in those towns and those cities and cared for people who couldn't care for themselves. It was unmerited favor. It was the love of strangers. And do you know by the 4th century, Christians were so good at the ministry of mercy and hospitality, and the church was doing this at such a high level, they had to scale this thing, and that is where we get the modern day hospital from, because Christians became responsible for health care. And so they built and designed an industry to take care of this. And we watch that move forward throughout history. And you see it in our own hospitals and doctors' facilities today. Our best people who care for people are most often people that are Christian and believe in the ministry of mercy and hospitality. Do you know that the world has been transformed by mercy and hospitality in the space of education? Education in the early century was only for the elite. But when the church decided to be merciful and hospitable, they decided that everybody deserved and should have an opportunity to learn and to grow. So the church made available the reading and the writing of everybody in the world. Do you know that the people of God took serious the words of Jesus and the ways of the church, and they said people need to have a renewed mind so that they can see the world differently as they walk in resurrection power. And it was Christians who led to building the university as a place where people could go and grow in their understanding of how to think and how to use their thinking to lead to their feelings and their feelings to lead to responding to the world. Do you know that it was the church that led to social reform and care for the poor and the vulnerable? That's all has its origin in Christians and the church being a people of mercy and hospitality. Do you know that slavery was abolished because of a group of convicted Christians? We've got a long way to go on this. We'll talk about this in just a couple weeks. But do you know, had it not been Christians who were looking around religiously, politically, socially, and internally, they could have made all sorts of lists that were different. They could have made all sorts of excuses. They could have lacked urgency, but instead, compelled by the mercy of God in their lives and the favor handed to them, they decided to become a people of mercy and hospitality, and they said, we cannot continue to live in human history the way that we currently are, and Christians led the way in the abolishment of slavery. Do you know that the church has transformed the way that the world sees their resources It is Christianity that has led the way for people to not hoard their own wealth to gain personal or collective power, but rather to redistribute the blessings that God has granted to us as a way to bless the world that God loves. All of these things are things that the churches have done throughout history because they've been transformed by the resurrection of Jesus, and they chose not to just continue in business as usual, but to walk in resurrection power. That's the church throughout history. Can I just give you a quick little glimpse in what the church is currently doing? We have our very own Amy Sue, who's on the Mercy ship, and it is still the church today that is providing medical attention to the most vulnerable around our world that otherwise wouldn't have medical access. They can go on a ship and get health care and surgeries and then be redeployed back to their homelands to live differently and to fulfill God's design and dream for them. There's not just the Mercy ship, but there's also another ship that tours the world and goes to places that lack education and teaches them how to read and to write so that they can grow up and make a better future for the people that they live among. Did you know that right now there are people all around the world that don't have access to clean water? To drink is to die in their culture. And do you know that it's the Christians and the church that are leading the way in providing clean water around the world? Do you know that the church right now is the leading people who are funding the adoption of children that otherwise wouldn't have resources to live a meaningful life? Through Compassion International, FNC, many of you have adopted people in your own worlds because you believe in the ministry of mercy and hospitality. Can I tell you, we often around here don't share a lot about what we do because we're the type of church that wants to sit in the back of the room and serve the people, and we don't need any seat at the table. And so oftentimes much of what we do goes unheard of. And that's really important that it stays that way. But sometimes when it goes unheard of, we can forget to teach people how to do it in general. But I can just tell you right now that if Madison Park evaporated out of Quincy, Illinois, that this area and the surrounding areas would be deeply impacted by the human crisis that exists among us because of the level in which we are invested in the ministries and the partnerships in the area of mercy and hospitality. So I want to leave you with one little thing. It's a little challenge because we're doing good. But again, this isn't about a thermometer. Oh, we're doing good. This is about a thermostat. This is about setting the model for how the world experiences the very favor of God and the love of God, mercy and hospitality. And I would suggest to many of us that we are neglecting to fully tap into the resources that God has empowered us through His Spirit. Let me just give you a couple examples. Many of us today are living in homes that when we were 25 years old, we were like, yeah, I could have never lived there. There's no way I'm going to get a house like that by then. When we were 13, we all were going to live in mansions, right? That didn't work out for most of us. But at 25, we were like, God, can you just give me a house? And can I suggest that many of us live in houses, and from the outside, these houses look really good, but I think if Jesus were walking among us, just like in Luke 14, I think He would ask us this question. A lot of people see the outside of your house and they think you're doing good. How many people have been in your house to experience good? I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves. Are we opening up our homes to the ministry of mercy and hospitality? I think Jesus would say, hey, guys, just so you know, your generation has more cars in the driveway than any generation throughout human history. And cars are expensive and they look cool and they're functional. We have to have them. But I think He would say to us, man, when you drive down the road, those are cool cars on the outside. Who has sat on the inside of that car and received mercy and hospitality? Is that car taking you to places where you are consistently extending mercy and hospitality? I think in our businesses, Jesus would ask us, hey, I know it's hard to take a chance on a stranger, an outsider, somebody of questionable character, but I think Jesus would say, you don't have to hire 10 out of 10 of these people, but because of mercy and hospitality, would you consider hiring one? Would you consider bringing into your family one? I think that those are the things that Jesus would ask us on mercy and hospitality. And we have to be reminded, because of God's unmerited favor on us, we need to be the people who set the tone in how others experience the unmerited favor of God. I'm going to ask you to stand with me. Paul prays this prayer to a church that he deeply loves in Philippi. And Paul prays this because he knows that we don't set the standard that God has called his church to be set apart for by our own human abilities. It's only by the resurrection power of Jesus. The disciples had to make a decision to follow that power and not their flesh. And you and I have to make decisions to follow that power and not our flesh. And so Paul gives these words to a church he loves, and I want to give them to you. Paul says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in his suffering, becoming like him in his death. By any means possible, I may attain the resurrection from the dead. What Paul is saying is, he is not here. He has risen. And if you want to participate in the resurrection power of God, you have to follow the resurrection ways of God. May we be a people led by God's mercy and hospitality to be people of mercy and hospitality.